Rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God for you. In America, we have come to the darkest days of the pandemic. 290,000 Americans have died. We lose almost daily about the same number of people as perished in the September 11th terrorist attacks. And yet it's business as usual in so many places, even when it's as if 10 to 15 passenger jets were falling out of the sky every day. On Thursday, I heard the news that someone very close to me talked about taking his own life. And there are many things that are very difficult in my personal life right now. And I'm sure that's true for many of you. And yet the Apostle Paul, in the oldest section of the New Testament, writes this simple instruction: rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. Give thanks in all circumstances. My question today is quite simple. How can we be people who rejoice always? How can we rejoice and move the act of rejoicing to the center of our lives? As a young child, I spent summers in Chelsea, Vermont. And in many ways, it was just an extraordinary place. There were just whole worlds to learn about and adventures to be had. I knew that the parents, my grandparents, who looked after me during those summer days, loved me deeply. They had an old barn behind their farmhouse, and it was an extraordinary place. You could see the light coming through all the dust in the cracks in the wall, in the planks on the boards on the walls. You could smell the smell of hay and the musty smell of things that had been there before. It was probably not a very safe place. There were floorboards that were missing, and not all the steps that went up to the hayloft were in place. And there were tons of extraordinary treasures there, like old farm equipment or a Victrola record player from decades before. That barn collapsed long ago, and the farmhouse, it was turned into condominiums. And yet, even if they were still there and still the same, I could not go back there because I have changed. I am no longer that boy who is living in the shelter of my grandparents' love. Plato and Aristotle agree that the beginning of all philosophy is wonder. David Bentley Hart suggests that all thought even begins in a moment of unsettling or delighted surprise. He writes, not that is in a simple twinge of curiosity or bafflement regarding some fact out there not yet in one's possession. If anything, it is the sudden awareness that no mere fact can possibly be adequate explanation of the mystery in which one finds oneself immersed in every moment. It is the astonishing recollection of something one has forgotten only because it is always present, a primordial agitation of the mind and will, an abiding amazement that lies just below the surface of conscious thought. He goes on saying, it may be that when we are small children, before we have learned to forget the obvious, we know this wonder in a more constant, innocent, and luminous way, because we are still open to the sheer, inexplicable givenness of the world. I think this is what it means when in Mark's gospel it says that we are to receive the kingdom of God like a child. As we age, the world appears to us to be more worn out. That urgent immediacy disappears. The 17th century thinker Angelus Silesius writes, "Die Rose ist ohne Warum." sie blüht, weil sie blüht. The rose is without why. It blooms because it blooms. I remember so vividly as a child having this feeling of amazement at the mystery of the world and creation, that I felt so at home at it. And I remember even trying to explain it to my mother. Isn't it extraordinary, this gift of our existence? Isn't it amazing that we are alive? And a few weeks later, my mom gave me a book about the birds and the bees. I remember it because it was illustrated with cartoon drawings of a middle-aged couple. And mostly they had their clothes on, but in a few of the pages they had their clothes off. And now I find myself just looking like those people in the birds and the bees book. But she didn't understand. I wasn't asking the question of what caused what, or how do babies get born. But why is there something instead of nothing? Why is there this wonderful gift that keeps unfolding in new ways every day? Henry Nouwen was a teacher at my old seminary, and he was someone who was really interested in the idea of joy. He said happiness is something that we experience when we have a lot of positive circumstances, but joy is something that abides in us. He writes, joy is the experience of knowing that you are unconditionally loved and that nothing, sickness, failure, emotional distress, oppression, or even death can take that away. And so for him, joy and sorrow, joy and the disasters we see in this terrible pandemic can coexist, can be present in the same moment. The civil rights leader and famous rabbi of the 20th century, Joshua Abraham Heschel, he writes about this. He says that faith might primarily be a kind of faithfulness to a time when we had faith. So practically speaking, how do we recover that sense of wonder, this rejoicing in the intimacy of God? We cannot become children again, but how can we experience the world in this way more often? This week I found an answer to that question that was completely unexpected. The figure of John is so familiar to us that I sometimes wonder if we really see him anymore. We have so many long-term experiences with the idea and the symbol of what he stands for. But this week at Bible study, a friend of mine, Craig, made me see John in an entirely new way. Craig said, what a blessing it was that God put Jesus in a community of people who cared for him, and that he had John as his cousin, someone who loved him, who was clearly close as a friend to him. And suddenly, the John that I remembered, the John of isolation and condemnation, that John dissipated, and I began to see a kinder John, a John who cares about the immediacy that we might experience with the Holy One. John plays a role in all four Gospels. It makes him unique in some ways. All four Gospels make a reference to Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. A voice cries out, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Before this, I never noticed the uniqueness of John in the fourth Gospel. The other Gospels call him John the Baptizer or John the Baptist. And in this Gospel, they say that he is a voice, a witness, a voice who testifies to the truth that a light has entered our shared darkness. In this Gospel, in the Gospel of John, John the Baptist doesn't tell people to repent. He doesn't seem angry. He's not trying to change the society by condemning the practices of the people around him. The other Gospels have an emphasis, especially in Mark, on the idea of preparing the way of the one who's coming. And my friend, the teacher, Herman Wachin, a New Testament teacher, he says there's a big difference between preparing and straightening. Preparing, which is in the Gospel of Mark, is like fixing the potholes or resurfacing the streets. But in John, the gospel is about straightening. That is, getting rid of the detours. And the word is connected to our word for immediacy. Immediacy, straightening. It means getting rid of all the things in our lives that stand between us and an experience of union with the divine. Metaphorically, it means dispensing with the things and institutions and practices and habits that separate us from God. The word John uses is the one that the ancient witnesses use to describe straightening one's way, straightening one's heart, straightening the path that one takes when you're steering a boat through a storm. And John believes no structures should stand in the way between us and God. When the religious authorities persist in asking if John is the Christ, he says 3 times. It's like in the ancient law court, you would make an oath by saying something 3 times. And what he's saying is that he is not the Messiah. And that humility, the humility of not even being worthy to tie the Messiah's shoes, that humility is central to finding God in unexpected places. Our ego cannot remain at the center of our life if we are to be people who are people of rejoicing. As Paul writes, we can work toward making all of our life, every moment, a prayer to God, reaching beyond our ego, offering prayers of thanks to God throughout the day. We return to that child's sense of wonder and rejoicing. A rare illness came close to killing the poet Christian Wyman, and he wrote very compellingly about this. I recommend that you have a look at it. He says that fear is not the reason why there are no atheists in foxholes. He writes, quote, "You don't turn to God in a crisis because you are afraid, at least not primarily. You turn to God because for once, all that background chatter in your brain, all that pandemonium of blab ceases, and you can hear." And what some of us hear in those instances is a small, still voice. Imagine what you might hear in this Advent pandemonium, this Advent pandemic, as we wait for the one who so tenderly loves us from the very moment we came into existence. I want to close with a poem from the farmer poet Wendell Berry. Many of you probably read Wendell Berry and have appreciated him. This is a poem called "Remembering That It Happened Once." Remembering that it happened once. We cannot turn away the thought as we go out cold to our barns toward the long night's end, that we ourselves are living in the world it happened in when it first happened. That we ourselves, opening a stall, a latch thrown open countless times before, might find them breathing there, foreknown, the child bedded in straw, the mother kneeling over him, the husband standing in belief he scarcely can believe, in light that lights them from no source we see. An April morning's light, the air around them joyful as a choir. We stand with one hand on the door, looking into another world that is this world, the pale daylight coming just as before, our chores to do, the cattle all awake, our own white frozen breath hanging in front of us, and we are here as we have never been before, sighted as not before, our place holy, although we knew it not. Brothers and sisters, a light has entered our world of darkness. So let us thank God for our own memories of childhood wonder and an abiding amazement at beauty that lies just below the surface of our consciousness. Let us give thanks to God for the humility that we learn from John, our brother, and the desire for an immediate experience of the Holy One. And that one day, the chatter and noise that separate us from Christ will be quiet. And let us seek to rejoice always, to pray unceasingly, to give thanks in all circumstances. For this is the will of God for us.